I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're folding clothes in a quiet laundry room, scrubbing dishes after dinner, or sitting alone on a late subway ride home through the tunnels beneath Manhattan. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead like dying stars. Your hands are tired, your back aches, but something inside you refuses to break. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will surprise you. In the towering glass cathedral of a Manhattan penthouse, where the city's lights twinkle like diamonds 60 floors below, Maria Esperanza Rodriguez moves through shadows cast by crystal chandeliers. Her worn sneakers whisper against Italian marble floors that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. The silence here is different from the silence of her small apartment in East Harlem. This silence is heavy with money, thick with the kind of loneliness that wealth can't cure. Each morning at 5:30, Maria steps off the number 6 train at 59th Street, her reflection ghost-like in the subway car's grimy windows. She carries a canvas bag her mother sewed 40 years ago in El Salvador, its faded flowers still vibrant against the worn fabric. Inside, a thermos of café con leche, a small Bible with pages soft as tissue paper, and a photograph of 3 children who grew up calling her Tia Maria, though she was never able to have children of her own. The Harrison penthouse sprawls across the building's crown like a monument to success built on foundations of grief. Richard Harrison III, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune worth $800 million, built his own empire in biotech stocks and cryptocurrency investments that multiplied his wealth beyond measure. His portfolio includes Manhattan real estate, gold reserves, and a Bitcoin wallet holding enough digital currency to buy a small country. Yet all that money, all those assets and profit margins couldn't prevent the accident that left his wife Marianne suspended between life and death for 8 months now. The machines that keep her breathing cost more per day than Maria earns in a month, their electronic heartbeats echoing through rooms where human hearts have forgotten how to feel. Maria wasn't Richard's choice. His sister Charlotte, a Park Avenue socialite who managed her brother's domestic affairs from a comfortable distance, insisted they needed someone reliable. The Filipino woman quit after 3 days, Charlotte had explained during their last uncomfortable phone call. The Irish girl lasted a week. This one comes highly recommended by the Pemberton family on the Upper East Side. What Charlotte didn't mention was that Maria had worked for the Pembertons for 12 years, raising their children while her own dreams withered like flowers in winter shade. She'd left only when old Mrs. Pemberton died and the family decided they no longer needed full-time help. At 53, Maria found herself starting over, carrying letters of recommendation that praised her trustworthiness, but revealed nothing about the woman who hummed old boleros while folding laundry, who remembered everyone's birthday even when no one remembered hers. The first morning Maria entered the Harrison penthouse, the autumn light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows caught her by surprise. She'd grown accustomed to small spaces, cramped apartments where shadows lived in corners and sunlight rationed itself like a precious commodity. Here, light poured in from every direction, illuminating rooms that seemed to stretch forever. A living room larger than most entire apartments, a kitchen equipped with commercial-grade appliances that gleamed like surgical instruments. But the abundance of space only emphasized the absence of life. No children's laughter echoed off these walls, no family photos cluttered the pristine surfaces, no warm cooking smells lingered in the air. The penthouse was a mausoleum wrapped in luxury, beautiful and cold as a winter sky before snow. Richard Harrison moved through his domain like a ghost haunting his own life. Tall and broad-shouldered, with premature silver threading through dark hair, he carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to boardrooms where his word moved millions of dollars with a nod. But grief had carved new lines around his eyes, and success felt hollow when the person he'd built it all for lay motionless 3 floors below in a private medical facility that money couldn't make feel less like a tomb. He acknowledged Maria's presence with curt nods and terse instructions, delivered without meeting her eyes. The master suite remains off-limits. Mrs. Harrison's medications must be recorded and stored exactly as prescribed. Any questions should be directed to Charlotte. His voice carried the flat efficiency of a man who'd learned to conduct his personal life like a business transaction. Emotions relegated to the budget column marked unnecessary expenses. The other household staff treated Maria with a particular cruelty reserved for newcomers who might upset established hierarchies. Helena, the day nurse who monitored Marianne's care, spoke to Maria in the tone reserved for children or pets. James, the building's concierge, made a show of checking Maria's identification each morning as if she hadn't been cleared for entry just the day before. Even Mrs. Chen, the part-time cook who prepared Richard's meals with mechanical precision, viewed Maria's presence as an intrusion into territory she'd claimed through years of silent service. They whispered in corners when Maria passed, their conversations stopping mid-sentence, like guilty secrets. In their eyes, she was temporary help, another in the parade of women who'd tried and failed to bring warmth to rooms that seemed determined to remain cold. Yet Maria moved through their subtle hostilities like water flowing around stones, neither fighting the current nor allowing it to change her course. She'd learned long ago that dignity was something no one could take away unless you handed it to them, and her hands were too busy with work to spare any for surrender. Each morning she climbed 3 flights of service stairs to avoid the main elevator, her knees protesting but her spine straight. She cleaned with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a job done halfway was no job at all, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. Mija, our work is our prayer. Make it worthy of God's attention. The penthouse revealed its secrets slowly to Maria's careful eyes. In Richard's study, financial statements scattered across a mahogany desk told stories of wealth that seemed almost fictional. Stock portfolios worth tens of millions, real estate holdings spanning 3 countries, investment returns that added thousands to his net worth each day, even while he slept. But scattered among these documents of prosperity were other papers, medical bills that ran into 6 figures, consultations with specialists whose fees could buy luxury cars, experimental treatments that promised hope but delivered only more waiting. Money, Maria realized, was both Richard's greatest weapon and his most useless tool. It could buy the finest medical care in the world, but it couldn't wake his wife from her endless sleep. In Marianne's private medical suite on the building's 57th floor, machines hummed their electronic lullabies 24 hours a day. Maria had been instructed to dust and organize this space weekly, always in Helena's presence, always with the understanding that she was not to touch anything directly connected to the patient's care. But Maria's eyes, trained by years of caring for others, noticed things the medical professionals missed. The way Marianne's fingers would sometimes twitch when classical music played on the room's hidden speakers. How her breathing seemed to deepen when someone spoke to her rather than about her. The fact that her lips would move slightly, as if trying to form words that couldn't quite reach the surface of consciousness. Marianne Harrison had been beautiful in the way that money could perfect. Personal trainers and nutritionists, skilled surgeons and expensive skincare, wardrobes curated by stylists who understood the language of luxury. Even in her medically induced sleep, traces of that beauty remained. The elegant bone structure that photographs well, the manicured nails that still gleamed with neutral polish, the honey-colored hair that someone, Helena, Maria assumed, kept styled in soft waves around her face. But there was something else, something the beauty couldn't quite hide. A sadness that seemed to have settled into her features long before the accident, as if she'd been practicing for this endless sleep for years. The children, when they visited, were strangers in their own home. Susan, 16 and sharp-edged with the particular anger of adolescence mixed with grief, treated the penthouse like a hotel where she occasionally stored her belongings between boarding school and summer programs. She moved through rooms with the restless energy of someone who'd learned that staying still too long meant feeling too much. Michael, 13 and softer around the edges but no less wounded, spent his visits with noise-canceling headphones clamped over his ears, his eyes fixed on phone screens that provided escape from the silence his family had learned to inhabit. They acknowledged Maria's presence with the casual indifference of children raised by staff, neither cruel nor kind, simply unaware that the woman cleaning their rooms might have stories worth hearing. Christmas approached the Harrison penthouse like an unwelcome guest that couldn't be turned away at the door. Charlotte arranged for decorations to be installed by a professional service. A 12-foot Norwegian spruce in the living room, garlands draped along banisters, lights that twinkled with programmed precision. The tree cost more than Maria's rent for 6 months, but its beauty felt hollow, like a stage set for a play no one wanted to perform. Richard walked past the decorations without comment, his attention focused on quarterly reports and board meetings that couldn't be postponed for holidays. The children would be skiing in Aspen with Charlotte's family, a tradition that continued mainly because no one had the energy to start new ones. On December 23rd, as snow fell past the penthouse windows like confetti from heaven, Maria found herself alone with the decorations and the silence. The cleaning service had been dismissed for the holiday week. Helena had taken her first vacation in 2 years, and even Mrs. Chen had returned to her family in Chinatown. Maria moved through the empty rooms with a purpose beyond mere cleaning, her hands touching surfaces with the familiarity of months spent learning the penthouse's moods. In the kitchen, she discovered ingredients that had been ordered but never used, fresh herbs wilting in the refrigerator, spices that had never been opened, good olive oil growing thick with neglect. Without asking permission she couldn't receive from an absent employer, Maria began to cook. Not the simple meals she prepared in her own small kitchen, but the foods of celebration her grandmother had taught her decades ago in a different country, under a different sky. Arroz con pollo that filled the kitchen with the scent of saffron and memory. Flan that required patience and faith in equal measure. Bread that needed kneading and time, and the kind of attention that couldn't be hurried or bought. As she worked, she hummed the songs her mother had sung while cooking for feast days, melodies that carried joy across generations and languages. The smell of real food cooking in the Harrison penthouse was revolution disguised as kindness. For months the kitchen had served only as a place where Mrs. Chen prepared bland, efficient meals designed for Richard's careful diet and Helena's convenience. But now the air itself seemed to wake up, carrying stories of family dinners and grandmother's hands and holidays when being together mattered more than being perfect. The scents drifted through rooms that had forgotten what home could smell like, settling into corners where loneliness had made itself comfortable. Richard returned from his office on Christmas Eve to find the penthouse transformed, not by decorations, but by the simple presence of life being lived within its walls. The smell of cooking drew him toward the kitchen like a man who'd been lost in the desert following the scent of water. He found Maria there, her hands busy with tasks that seemed to require her entire attention, her voice soft with songs in Spanish that he couldn't understand but somehow recognized as the sound of happiness expressed in work made sacred. Maria looked up as he entered, her eyes meeting his with the directness of someone who'd learned that truth was simpler than pretense. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her accent adding music to words that might have sounded apologetic from someone else. "I thought the house was too quiet for Christmas." She gestured toward the stove where something simmered in a pot large enough to feed a family, though they both knew the family that lived here had forgotten how to gather around tables that meant more than just places to eat. For the first time in months, Richard found himself without words that came easily. The business world had taught him to fill silences with negotiations, to treat every interaction as a transaction where value had to be extracted or defended. But standing in his own kitchen while a woman he barely knew cooked food that smelled like some lost memory of contentment, he discovered that some moments demanded nothing more than presence. "It smells," he began, then stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound ridiculous. "It smells like a home where people are happy." Maria's smile was gentle without being pitying, understanding without being presumptuous. "Food is just ingredients until someone cooks it with love," she said, stirring something that steamed and bubbled with promise. "Your wife, she must have cooked for you sometimes, before." The question was implicit, careful, giving him room to retreat if the territory felt too dangerous. Richard leaned against the kitchen island, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume he'd forgotten he was wearing. "Marianne couldn't boil water without setting off smoke alarms," he said, And for a moment, his voice carried the echo of laughter shared in this same kitchen years ago. "We had Mrs. Patterson then. She'd been with Marianne's family since before we met. Cooked like someone who understood that food was supposed to make you feel loved, not just fed." The memory surfaced without his permission, bringing with it the sharp pain of recognition. This was the first time in months he'd spoken about Marianne as if she were still capable of burning water, still capable of anything beyond the mechanical breathing that machines counted in beeps and sighs. They stood together in the kitchen's warmth, surrounded by the sounds of oil sizzling and onions softening and time passing in the way it was supposed to, measured not in productivity or profit margins, but in the gentle alchemy of ingredients becoming something greater than their separate parts. Maria moved with the confidence of someone who'd learned her skills not from books or classes, but from generations of women who understood that feeding people was a form of love that required no explanation or justification. "Your children," Maria said. "They come home tomorrow?" Her question carried the assumption that family gathered during holidays, even families that seemed more like collections of individuals sharing the same address. Richard's laugh held no humor. "Susan's in Aspen with my sister. Michael's at some winter program in Vermont that costs more than most people's salaries. They prefer it that way, less complicated than being here with me." The confession emerged before he could edit it into something more palatable, more appropriate for the distance he usually maintained between himself and the staff who moved through his private spaces. Maria turned from the stove to face him directly, her eyes holding the kind of steady attention that he'd learned to recognize in boardrooms as the look of someone preparing to say something that mattered. "Children don't prefer to be away from their parents," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised children who weren't her own, who'd learned to read the spaces between words where real feelings lived. "They learn to protect themselves from pain by going where it hurts less to feel love." The observation hit Richard with the peculiar force of truth delivered without malice, stated as fact rather than judgment. In the business world, he was accustomed to people telling him what they thought he wanted to hear, their words calculated to produce desired outcomes. But Maria spoke as if the truth were simply something that existed, like gravity or weather, requiring no particular courage to acknowledge. "I don't know how to talk to them anymore," he admitted, the words emerging from some place deeper than the careful control he'd maintained for months. "Everything I say sounds like I'm reading from a script about how fathers are supposed to comfort their children. But I don't know how to comfort anyone when I can't figure out how to comfort myself." Maria moved to the refrigerator and retrieved a bottle of wine that had been there so long Richard had forgotten purchasing it. She poured 2 glasses, the ritual of hospitality so natural that it took him a moment to realize she was treating him as a guest in his own kitchen. "When my brother died," she said, settling into a chair at the kitchen's small table as if she belonged there, "I had to help raise his children, and I kept waiting to feel like I knew what I was doing. Kept thinking that someday the right words would come, the right way to fix their sadness." She took a small sip of wine, her expression thoughtful. "But children don't need us to fix their sadness. They need us to be sad with them, and then to show them that sadness doesn't last forever." Richard found himself sitting across from her, the informality of the moment striking him as more intimate than any business dinner or social gathering he'd attended in months. But what if the sadness does last forever? What if Marianne never wakes up? And this is just our life now? Then you learn to build a life that has space for that sadness without letting it take up all the room, Maria said simply. You learn that love doesn't stop when someone can't love you back the same way. It just changes shape. They sat in the kitchen's warmth while snow continued to fall outside, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. For the first time since the accident, Richard found himself in the presence of someone who didn't seem to expect him to be anything other than a man whose wife might not wake up, whose children had learned to find shelter away from home, whose money couldn't buy the only things that actually mattered. The food Maria had prepared required no special occasion to be perfect. It was perfect because it was made with the kind of attention that transformed cooking from chore into prayer. They ate together as snow blanketed Manhattan in temporary quiet, the city's usual chaos muffled by weather that imposed its own peace. Richard discovered that hunger was something he'd forgotten he could feel. That satisfaction could come from something as simple as flavors that reminded him food was supposed to nourish more than just the body. After dinner, Maria rose to clean, her movements efficient but unhurried. Richard found himself helping without being asked, drying dishes and storing leftovers as if he were someone who regularly participated in the ordinary rhythm of household tasks. Their conversation continued in comfortable pieces, observations about the snow, questions about the neighborhood where Maria lived, stories about the restaurants Richard used to frequent when eating, was something he did for pleasure rather than fuel. "I should pay you extra for this," Richard said as they finished, the businessman in him compelled to assign value to kindness received. Maria's expression grew gentle but firm. "Some things aren't for sale," she said. "This was just Christmas Eve, and nobody should spend Christmas Eve alone if there's another choice." That night, for the first time in months, Richard slept without the aid of the prescription medications that usually wrestled his mind into temporary unconsciousness. He dreamed of kitchens filled with warmth and conversations that didn't require careful navigation around topics too painful to touch. He dreamed of Marianne laughing at something he couldn't quite catch upon waking, her laugh bright and present, rather than preserved like something in amber, beautiful but no longer alive. When morning came, the penthouse felt different. Not transformed exactly, but somehow more like a place where people might actually live rather than simply exist. The smell of the previous evening's cooking lingered like a promise that warmth was possible, that isolation was a choice rather than an inevitability. Richard found himself looking forward to Maria's return after the holiday, anticipating not just the restoration of order to his domestic life, but the continuance of something harder to define, the presence of someone who seemed to understand that caring for people was work that demanded skill, but also required something money couldn't purchase, the revelation that hospitality could exist without transaction, that conversation could occur without agenda, that kindness could be offered without expectation of return. These discoveries settled into Richard's understanding of what his life might contain beyond the narrow confines of obligation and grief. For the first time since the accident, he found himself curious about tomorrow rather than simply enduring it. In the medical facility 3 floors below, Marianne's vital signs remained steady, her breathing assisted by machines that would continue their faithful work regardless of seasons or celebrations. But something in the building's atmosphere had shifted, subtle as air pressure changing before weather moves in. The staff noticed it without being able to name it. Rooms that seemed somehow less heavy, silence that felt more peaceful than oppressive, air that carried traces of something more complex than the usual smell of expensive cleaning products and perfect climate control. Change, when it finally arrived in the Harrison household, came not as dramatic revelation but as gradual awakening, like dawn approaching so slowly that darkness retreats one shade at a time until suddenly there is light where there had been only shadow. And Maria, moving through this expensive quietude, with her worn hands and patient heart, became the still point around which a frozen world began its careful thaw. The new year arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes Manhattan feel like a city carved from ice, all sharp edges and unforgiving surfaces. Richard returned to his office routine with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to use work as insulation against feeling too much. But something had shifted in the daily rhythm of his life, a subtle alteration in the way he moved through spaces that Maria had touched with her particular brand of careful attention. She arrived each morning at precisely 7, her footsteps on the marble foyer announced by a softness that managed to be both respectful and confident. The penthouse responded to her presence like a held breath finally released. Coffee appeared without fanfare, brewed with the care of someone who understood that morning rituals could carry a person through difficult days. Fresh flowers materialized in precisely the right locations, not the ostentatious arrangements Charlotte ordered for social occasions, but simple combinations that brought color without demanding attention. In the weeks following their Christmas Eve conversation, Richard found himself unconsciously adjusting his schedule to cross paths with Maria during her daily rounds. He would emerge from his home office when he heard her moving through the living room, manufacturing reasons to retrieve documents or make phone calls in spaces where their presence might naturally overlap. These encounters rarely lasted more than a few minutes, but they provided punctuation marks in days that had previously felt like endless run-on sentences. Maria treated these meetings with the same gentle directness she brought to everything else, acknowledging his presence without assuming anything about his motivations, answering questions he didn't quite know how to ask, offering observations that somehow addressed concerns he hadn't learned to articulate. She possessed the rare gift of making conversation feel both significant and effortless, like someone skilled at finding the human thread that connected disparate experiences. "Your wife's room," Maria said one February morning as she organized the day's mail. "The machines sound different when I clean there on Tuesdays?" Richard looked up from his laptop, productivity briefly forgotten. "Different how?" "Quieter, like they're trying not to disturb something." Maria's hands continued sorting envelopes as she spoke, her attention divided, but her meaning clear. "Helena mentioned that Tuesdays are when you visit." The observation struck Richard as both obvious and revolutionary. Of course, the medical equipment would seem quieter when he was there reading quarterly reports aloud or sitting in silence beside Mary Ann's bed. But Maria's comment suggested she'd noticed patterns that revealed something about the nature of presence itself, the way attention could alter the quality of space even when nothing visible changed. "I read to her," he said, the confession emerging without his permission. "Financial reports, mostly, board meeting minutes. I figured she'd want to know how the companies are performing." Maria's smile was gentle without being condescending. "What did she like you to read before, when she could ask?" The question opened a door Richard hadn't realized was locked. "Poetry," he said, surprised by the word's emergence. She loved poetry. Had these worn collections she'd carried with her since college. Emily Dickinson, Maya Angelou, Robert Frost. She'd ask me to read them aloud while she cooked or did crossword puzzles. Said my voice made the words sound different than when she read them silently. "Maybe," Maria suggested with characteristic directness. "The machines sound quiet on Tuesdays because they're listening too." That afternoon, for the first time in 8 months, Richard visited Mary Ann's room carrying something other than business documents. The book of Emily Dickinson poems felt fragile in his hands, its spine cracked from years of handling by someone who'd found sustenance in carefully arranged words. He settled into the chair beside Mary Ann's bed and opened to page 1, beginning with poems about hope and birds and things that endured without explanation. His voice, rusty from disuse in this particular application, gradually warmed to the task. The words felt foreign at first, like a language he'd once spoken fluently but had nearly forgotten. But as he continued, muscle memory returned, the rhythm of reading for pleasure rather than information, the cadence of sharing something beautiful rather than merely efficient. The machines continued their electronic chorus, but somehow their sounds seemed to harmonize rather than compete with the older music of poetry and human voice. Helena, passing in the hallway, paused outside the door to listen. In 8 months of professional care, she'd rarely heard Mr. Harrison's voice in this room carry anything warmer than clinical concern or frustrated helplessness. But this sounded like a man talking to his wife rather than to her medical condition, and the difference was striking enough to make her reconsider her assumptions about love and its capacity to remain present, even when its object couldn't respond. When Richard finished reading, he closed the book and sat in silence beside Mary Ann's sleeping form. Her face, relaxed in medically induced unconsciousness, looked more peaceful than he remembered from their final argument. A fight about something so insignificant he couldn't even recall its subject, only the sharp edges of words spoken in frustration and never retracted. The accident had happened during her drive home from that argument, and guilt had become the lens through which he viewed every memory of their life together. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said to the room's expensive quiet, "but Maria thinks the machines listen when I read to you, and if machines can listen, maybe you can too." He reached for her hand, careful of the IV lines that connected her to bags of pharmaceutical hope. I'm sorry we fought about whatever stupid thing we fought about. I'm sorry I let work become more important than talking to you. I'm sorry it took almost losing you to remember that you liked poetry. Driving home through February rain that turned Manhattan's streets into rivers of reflected light, Richard found himself thinking about the differences between presence and proximity, between being with someone and simply occupying the same space. Maria had helped him recognize that the months he'd spent reading financial reports to an unconscious woman had been a kind of self-punishment disguised as devotion, penance that served his guilt rather than connection that honored what they'd once shared. The penthouse felt different that evening, charged with the possibility that change was occurring in increments too small to measure but too consistent to ignore. Maria had left dinner prepared with her usual attention to detail, but she'd also left a small card beside the covered plate. Food tastes better when it's shared with good memories. Try thinking about the first time you cooked together. The suggestion was simple enough to follow, personal enough to matter. Richard had dismissed the cooking staff early and found himself alone in the kitchen, reheating Maria's carefully prepared meal, while memory supplied details he'd forgotten he'd retained. Mary Ann's first attempt at making his grandmother's pasta sauce, how she'd burned the garlic and added too much wine and laughed at the disaster while ordering takeout instead. The Saturday mornings when they'd planned elaborate brunches that usually devolved into pancakes made from a box because neither of them possessed the patience for recipes that required measuring ingredients with precision. These memories returned not as painful reminders of loss, but as evidence of connection that existed independent of current circumstances. Love, Richard realized, wasn't diminished by the inability of one person to currently participate in it. It simply changed form, like energy that could neither be created nor destroyed, but could transform into something else that served different purposes. Over the following weeks, a routine developed that felt more like friendship than employment. Maria would arrive each morning to find the previous evening's dishes already cleaned, coffee prepared with the kind of attention to detail that indicated someone had learned to value small acts of consideration. Richard began leaving notes about household matters that seemed designed more to establish contact than to communicate necessary information. The good wine is in the kitchen cabinet if you want some with lunch, or Helena mentioned the flowers in Mary Ann's room make the space smell like hope. These exchanges felt significant beyond their apparent simplicity. They represented a form of communication that existed outside the traditional boundaries of employer and employee, a recognition that caring for someone's private space created intimacy that demanded acknowledgement rather than denial. Maria responded to these gestures with the same thoughtful attention she brought to everything else. Flowers appeared on Richard's desk without fanfare. Favorite foods materialized at dinner without discussion of preferences. Small adjustments occurred throughout the penthouse that made it function more like a home designed for comfort rather than a showplace designed to impress. The children's spring break visit arrived with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for medical procedures, necessary but dreaded. Susan, now 17 and sharp with the particular intelligence of young women who'd learned to trust only themselves, treated the penthouse like a luxury hotel where she happened to have a reservation. Michael, 14 and increasingly resembling the father he seemed determined to avoid becoming, spent his time in rooms far from wherever Richard might be found. But Maria's presence altered the family's familiar chemistry in ways that none of them had anticipated. She treated the children with the same respectful directness she showed their father, acknowledging their pain without trying to fix it, offering kindness without requiring gratitude in return, creating space for them to be human rather than simply successful or well-behaved. "Your room always smells like those candles your mom loved," Susan observed on her second day home, finding Maria folding laundry in the master bedroom that had remained unchanged since the accident. "Vanilla and something else I can't identify." "Lavender?" Maria supplied, smoothing wrinkles from expensive sheets with hands that understood the value of caring for beautiful things. She ordered them special from a place in France, said they reminded her of a hotel where you all stayed when you were little. Susan perched on the edge of the bed she'd rarely entered since returning home from school. "I remember that trip. Michael got food poisoning from eating too much gelato, and Dad carried him up 3 flights of stairs to our room because the elevator was broken. Her voice carried the particular wistfulness of someone revisiting happiness from a time when happiness felt permanent rather than temporary. "Parents do things like that," Maria said, her observation delivered without judgment, but with the authority of someone who'd watched many families navigate the distance between love and its expression. "Carry children upstairs. Remember favorite smells. Try to create perfect moments that last longer than moments usually do." "He doesn't talk to us about her," Susan said, the words emerging as confession rather than complaint. "About Mom. Like if we don't say her name, we can pretend this is all temporary. Like she's just traveling somewhere and will be back when we figure out how to be a family again." "What's Skype?" Maria set down the towel she'd been folding and gave Susan her complete attention. "What do you want to say about her that nobody's let you say?" The question was so direct, so unadorned by the careful language adults usually used when discussing difficult topics with teenagers, that Susan found herself answering before her usual defenses could engage. "I want to say that I'm angry at her for leaving us. And I feel guilty about being angry because she didn't choose to leave. And I'm scared that if she wakes up, she won't remember who we were before this happened to us." Maria nodded, as if these concerns were perfectly reasonable rather than contradictory. "Anger and love can exist together," she said. "Fear and hope too. You don't have to choose just one feeling about something this complicated." "Dad thinks feelings have to be managed, like emotions are problems that can be solved with the right strategy." Susan's laugh held no humor. "He's been reading poetry to her. Did you know that? Helena told me. He used to hate when she read poetry, said it was impractical, like studying something that couldn't produce measurable results." "People change when they have to," Maria observed. "Sometimes crisis teaches us things that success can't. Maybe your father's learning that some results can't be measured, but still matter more than everything that can be." That evening, for the first time since Christmas, the 3 Harrison family members found themselves in the kitchen at the same time. Maria had prepared a meal that required no particular occasion, simple food that tasted like comfort rather than obligation. Richard had emerged from his office without his usual laptop or phone, as if he decided that some conversations deserved his complete attention. Michael appeared with his headphones around his neck rather than clamped over his ears, a gesture so subtle that only a parent would recognize it as an invitation. The conversation that followed wasn't the kind of breakthrough moment that resolves problems with cinematic neatness. Instead, it was the kind of careful exploration that occurs when people who've learned to avoid emotional territory decide to risk mapping some of its borders. They talked about school and work and plans for summer vacation, but underneath these safe topics flowed acknowledgement that they were 3 people learning to be a family under circumstances none of them had chosen. "I'd like to visit Mom more," Michael said as they finished eating, his words directed toward his plate rather than his father. "Not just on birthdays and holidays, maybe on weekdays sometimes after school." Richard felt something inside his chest loosen, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I think that would be good," he said. "For both of you. For her too, maybe." Susan looked up from the dessert Maria had prepared, her expression carrying the particular hopefulness of someone testing whether it was safe to want something. "Could we read to her together sometimes? Not business stuff, but things she actually liked?" "Poetry," Richard said, the word emerging without his usual hesitation. "She loves poetry." Present tense, he corrected himself, the grammatical shift carrying weight beyond language. They spent the remainder of spring break establishing new patterns of connection, visiting Marianne together, taking turns reading aloud, learning to speak her name as if she were still present in their lives rather than simply preserved in their memories. Maria facilitated these moments without inserting herself into them, her presence providing the kind of steady support that allowed others to risk vulnerability without fear of judgment. But change, when it carries the freight of months of accumulated hope and fear, rarely arrives without complications. The morning after Susan and Michael returned to their respective schools, Richard discovered that their tentative progress toward healing had been observed with less than charitable interpretation by some members of his extended family. Charlotte arrived at the penthouse unannounced, her expression carrying the righteous indignation of someone who'd appointed herself guardian of propriety in situations that stretched far beyond her actual authority. She found Richard and Maria in the kitchen, discussing the week's schedule with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over months of shared domestic space. "We need to talk," Charlotte announced, her tone indicating that the conversation she had in mind wouldn't include Maria's participation. Privately. Richard felt something defensive rise in his chest, a protection instinct he hadn't experienced since adolescence. "Anything you need to say can be said in front of Maria. She's part of this household." Charlotte's laugh held the particular dismissiveness reserved for people who'd confused their economic position with their moral authority. "That's exactly what I'm here to discuss. People are talking, Richard, about your arrangement here, about how much time you spend with the help, how familiar you've all become. It's inappropriate, and it's not good for the children." Maria began to excuse herself from the conversation, her movements carrying the dignity of someone who'd learned to recognize when her presence had become inconvenient to people who outranked her in social hierarchies she'd never chosen to join, but Richard's voice stopped her before she could reach the door. "Stay," he said, the single word carrying more authority than Charlotte had heard from him in months. "This concerns you too." "It concerns the reputation of this family," Charlotte corrected, her voice rising with frustration that her concerns weren't being received as wisdom. "Marianne is lying in a coma, and you're playing house with the maid. What do you think people are going to say about that?" The words hung in the kitchen's air like smoke from something burned and toxic. Richard felt months of carefully controlled emotion surge toward the surface, anger mixed with protective instinct and the peculiar clarity that comes from recognizing a moment when character is revealed through choice. "I think," Richard said quietly, "that anyone who has something ugly to say about a woman who's brought more life to this house in 6 months than it had in the 8 months before she arrived is someone whose opinion I don't particularly value." Charlotte's expression shifted from righteous indignation to something closer to genuine concern. "I'm worried about you, about your judgment. You're vulnerable right now, and people like her—" She gestured toward Maria as if she were a category rather than a person. "People like her know how to take advantage of situations like this." "People like me?" Maria's voice cut through Charlotte's implications with surgical precision. "You mean people who work with their hands instead of inheriting money? People who clean other people's houses because that's honest work that pays for food and rent? Or do you mean people who don't look like you, who speak accented English, who come from countries you couldn't find on a map?" The challenge was delivered without anger, but with the kind of steady directness that forced Charlotte to confront what her concerns actually revealed about her assumptions. Richard watched this exchange with the peculiar fascination of someone observing a conversation that clarified relationships he'd been too polite to examine directly. "I mean, people who see opportunity in tragedy," Charlotte replied, but her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "People who understand that wealthy grieving widowers can be generous when they're lonely and grateful." Charlotte." Richard's voice carried warning that his sister recognized from their childhood, the tone their father had used when patience with poor behavior had reached its limit. "That's enough." "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, this looks exactly like what everyone's going to think it looks like." "Your wife is dying." "My wife is not dying." The words erupted from Richard with force that surprised all three of them. "My wife is in a coma, but she is not dying. And the woman who's helped me remember that difference, who's helped my children remember their mother's name is still present tense, who's made this house feel like a home instead of a museum. That woman deserves better than your suspicions about her motives." Charlotte stepped backward, as if his defense of Maria had physical weight. "Richard, I'm trying to protect you." "From what? From kindness? From connection? From remembering that people can care about each other without ulterior motives?" Richard moved to stand beside Maria, not touching her but clearly aligned with her position in the room. Maria has asked for nothing beyond fair payment for honest work. She's given us more than we've paid for, more than we deserved, and certainly more than we've given her in return." The silence that followed carried the weight of relationships permanently altered. Charlotte looked between Richard and Maria with the expression of someone who discovered that a situation she'd thought she understood had revealed complexities she wasn't equipped to handle. Maria stood quietly, her dignity intact, but her position in the household suddenly precarious in ways that hadn't existed an hour earlier. "People will talk," Charlotte said finally, her voice smaller than before but still carrying the stubborn persistence of someone who believed social propriety mattered more than personal truth. "Let them talk," Richard replied. "People who have never cleaned up anyone else's vomit or stayed late to prepare meals for children who were too angry to say thank you, those people's opinions about what constitutes appropriate behavior in crisis are less relevant to me than they used to be." Charlotte gathered her purse and coat with the efficient movements of someone retreating from territory that had become unexpectedly hostile. At the door, she turned back with one final attempt at establishing authority. "This isn't over, Richard. If you won't protect this family's reputation, I'll find other ways to address the situation." The threat hung in the air after Charlotte's departure like the residue of an unpleasant smell. Richard and Maria remained in the kitchen, the comfortable ease that had characterized their interaction replaced by awareness that their relationship had become something other people felt entitled to judge and potentially interfere with. "I should look for another job," Maria said finally, her voice steady but carrying undertones of resignation. "Before this becomes a problem that hurts your children or makes trouble for your wife's care." "You should stay," Richard countered, "because this is your job. You do it well. And other people's discomfort with kindness is their problem to solve, not ours." But they both understood that some complications, once introduced into previously stable situations, create pressures that good intentions can't always withstand. The penthouse that had begun to feel like a home where healing was possible suddenly felt fragile, temporary, threatened by forces that existed outside their control but possessed power to impose consequences neither of them had chosen. Change, when it arrived, came with the brutal efficiency of legal documents and economic pressure, applied by people who confused their financial power with moral authority. Charlotte's threat materialized in the form of family lawyers suggesting that Richard's judgment had been compromised by grief, that perhaps decisions about Marianne's continuing care required input from relatives who maintained objective perspective. The suggestion was delicately worded but clearly understood. "Continue your inappropriate relationship with the household staff, and we'll challenge your authority to make medical decisions for your wife." The leverage was precise, targeted, devastating in its efficiency. Richard could fight for his right to employ whomever he chose, but fighting would require time, energy, and attention that he couldn't afford to divert from Marianne's care. The conversation where Richard explained these circumstances to Maria occurred in the penthouse's living room on a Thursday evening when rain turned Manhattan's windows into rivers of distorted light. They sat on opposite ends of a sofa that cost more than most people earned in a year, the distance between them measuring not physical space but the gulf between what they wanted to do and what circumstances would permit them to choose. "I can't ask you to leave," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned that power in one area of life didn't necessarily translate to power in others. "But I can't protect you from the consequences of staying either. If this becomes about legal challenges to Marianne's care, everyone loses." Maria listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who'd received difficult news before and learned to absorb its impact without resistance. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that the rain against windows became the room's primary sound. "The jobs that pay well enough to matter," she said finally, "those jobs are hard to find for women like me, especially when the last employer can't write a recommendation letter without explaining why I left." The practical reality of her situation hit Richard with force he hadn't anticipated. In the months of their growing connection, He'd somehow managed to forget that Maria's life extended beyond the boundaries of his household, that she was a woman with her own financial pressures and professional considerations rather than simply someone who happened to provide services he'd learned to value. "I have savings," he said, the offer emerging before he'd fully considered its implications. "Enough to help you through several months of looking for something else. Enough to make sure you don't suffer financially because of problems that aren't your making." Maria's smile was gentle but firm. "Some things can't be fixed with money," she said. "This situation, it's not about what you can afford to pay. It's about what people will allow you to pay for." They sat together in the expensive quiet, both understanding that circumstances beyond their control had imposed choices neither of them wanted to make. The rain continued its percussion against glass, providing a soundtrack for the kind of ending that arrived without resolution or satisfaction, prompted by external pressure rather than internal conclusion. "I'll work through the end of the month," Maria said, her voice carrying the practical tone of someone who had learned to navigate disappointment through planning rather than protest. "That gives you time to find someone else, and me time to find another position. We'll both write letters of recommendation that focus on professional qualifications rather than personal relationships." The agreement was reasonable, mature, designed to minimize damage to both their futures. It was also heartbreaking in its necessity, a reminder that connection between people of different economic circumstances was often subject to scrutiny and interference that no one subjected to relationships between social equals. That night, Richard called Helena to schedule additional visiting hours with Marianne. He needed to explain to his wife, who might or might not be able to hear him, that the woman who'd helped bring their family back from the edge of emotional extinction would be leaving not because she wanted to, but because other people had decided her presence was inappropriate. Sitting beside Marianne's bed, while machines counted heartbeats and breaths with mechanical precision, Richard found himself speaking more honestly than he had since the accident. He told her about Christmas Eve dinner and poetry readings, about Susan's anger and Michael's tentative hope, about Maria's quiet strength and Charlotte's fears. He explained that sometimes choosing to protect one person required sacrificing relationship with another, and that this particular choice felt like a betrayal of everything Maria had helped him remember about the value of human connection. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said, holding Marianne's hand between his own. "But if you can, I need you to know that the woman who's been taking care of our house has been taking care of our hearts too, and I'm about to lose her because people think caring is the same as taking advantage, and I don't have enough power to fight both gravity and money at the same time." The machines continued their electronic chorus, but for just a moment Richard thought he felt pressure from Marianne's fingers. So slight it might have been imagination, so definite it felt like response. He waited, holding his breath and her hand, hoping for repetition of whatever sensation had passed between them. But the moment stretched into minutes with no further sign, and eventually Richard assigned the experience to the category of wishful thinking rather than medical development. Still, driving home through rain that made Manhattan's streets look like abstract paintings of light and motion, he carried with him the possibility that consciousness might exist in forms too subtle for machines to measure. That connection might persist even when its usual expressions had been rendered impossible by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The final 2 weeks of Maria's employment passed with the peculiar intensity of relationships reaching conclusion before their natural end. Every shared meal felt significant. Every casual conversation carried weight. Every ordinary moment was preserved with the attention usually reserved for experiences that wouldn't be repeated. Richard found himself documenting these final days with the dedication of someone creating a record of something precious and temporary. He noticed the way Maria arranged flowers, not in the precise symmetry preferred by professional services, but in combinations that seemed to occur naturally, as if the blooms had chosen their own companions. He observed how she moved through the penthouse's spaces, not with the deference of someone who belonged elsewhere, but with the familiar confidence of someone who'd learned every room's moods and requirements. Most significantly, he watched her interactions with Susan and Michael during their final weekend visit. Both children had received the news of her departure with the resigned disappointment of people who'd learned not to invest too heavily in stability that depended on adult decisions they couldn't influence. But Maria treated their concern with characteristic directness, neither minimizing the loss nor dramatizing it beyond its actual proportions. "People come into our lives for different amounts of time," she told Susan during a conversation about change and impermanence. "Some people stay for years, some for months, some for moments. The time doesn't determine the importance. What matters is what we learn from each other while we're together." "But what if I'm not finished learning from you?" Susan asked, her 17-year-old bravado unable to fully disguise the child's confusion about adults making decisions that seemed to prioritize other people's comfort over her emotional needs. Maria's answer came with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to find meaning in experiences that couldn't be extended beyond their natural limits. "Then you take what you've learned so far and keep learning from other people, and maybe someday when you're older, you'll understand that some of the most important lessons come from watching people we care about handle difficult situations with dignity." On Maria's final day, she completed her usual tasks with the same attention to detail that had characterized her work from the beginning, but she also left small gifts throughout the penthouse. Not expensive items, but things she'd made or chosen with specific people in mind. For Richard, a cookbook containing recipes from her grandmother's kitchen with notes about which dishes were appropriate for memorial dinners and which were better suited to celebration. For Susan, a journal bound in leather, soft as silk, its blank pages waiting for poetry or prose or whatever form self-expression might take. For Michael, a photograph she'd taken of him and his father reading together in Mary Ann's room, capturing a moment of connection they might not have recognized as significant without being shown it through her eyes. But the most meaningful gift was one that couldn't be wrapped or presented ceremonially. Throughout her months in the Harrison household, Maria had demonstrated that caring for people was work that required skill, intelligence, and emotional strength, rather than simply good intentions and available time. She'd shown them that domestic work was skilled labor deserving of respect rather than charity to be dispensed according to the giver's whims. More importantly, she'd helped them understand that healing occurs not through grand gestures or expensive interventions, but through consistent presence, small acts of kindness, and the patience to allow change to happen at its own pace rather than according to anyone's preferred timeline. As Maria gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave the penthouse for the final time, Richard struggled with the inadequacy of traditional employer-employee parting rituals. Severance pay and letters of recommendation felt insufficient to acknowledge what she'd contributed to their family's recovery from crisis, but he lacked vocabulary for expressing gratitude that transcended professional boundaries. "I don't know how to thank you," he said as they stood together in the foyer where she'd first entered their lives, "for everything you've done that wasn't in any job description." Maria's response carried the grace of someone who'd learned to receive appreciation without requiring it for validation. "You thank me by remembering that kindness isn't charity, by treating the next person who works in your home like someone whose life matters beyond what they can do for you, by teaching your children that service is honorable work, not something people do because they're not smart enough for better jobs." She paused at the door, looking back at the penthouse that had been her workplace, and in some ways her home for 8 months, and by reading poetry to your wife until she wakes up to hear it. After Maria left, the penthouse felt not just empty, but somehow diminished, as if her presence had been essential to its function as a home rather than merely a luxury dwelling. Richard moved through rooms that seemed to echo with her absence, noticing details she'd attended to that had become invisible through familiarity. Fresh towels folded with hotel precision, flowers replaced before they could fully fade, surfaces that gleamed without apparent effort. But more than the physical manifestations of her care, what he missed was the presence of someone who'd understood that household management was really people management, the skill of creating environments where individuals could flourish rather than simply exist. Maria had possessed the rare ability to see what families needed beyond what they asked for, to provide support that strengthened rather than created dependence. The replacement housekeeper, recommended by Charlotte and hired through an agency that specialized in staff for high-profile households, was competent, professional, and absolutely committed to maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal and professional relationships. She completed her assigned tasks efficiently, communicated through written notes rather than conversation, and treated the Harrison family with the kind of respectful distance that prevented complications but also precluded connection. Within 2 weeks, Richard understood the difference between having someone clean his house and having someone care for his home. The new arrangement was unquestionably appropriate by any measure Charlotte might apply, but it was also sterile in ways that made the penthouse feel like a hotel rather than a place where people lived lives that mattered to each other. The realization that Maria's impact on their family extended far beyond domestic services became clear during the children's first visit after her departure. Susan wandered through rooms with the restless energy of someone looking for something that was no longer there. Michael asked direct questions about her whereabouts that Richard found difficult to answer without revealing the role family politics had played in her leaving. She got a better job, he explained, the half-truth sitting uncomfortably, but serving its purpose of protecting everyone from more complicated discussions about power and prejudice and the ways financial security could be weaponized against human connection. But children, especially children who'd learned to read adult behavior for signs of trouble, weren't easily satisfied with explanations that glossed over obvious emotional complexity. Susan's expression suggested she understood exactly what kind of better job would require someone to leave abruptly after months of apparent satisfaction with her current position. "People like Charlotte don't think people like Maria belong in places like this," Susan observed with the particular clarity that adolescence sometimes brings to social analysis. They think money creates categories of human beings, and those categories aren't supposed to mix. Her assessment was accurate enough to make Richard uncomfortable with his own role in a situation that had prioritized social propriety over personal connection. He'd chosen to protect Marianne's medical care rather than fight for Maria's continued presence. But the choice was starting to feel less like wisdom and more like cowardice, disguised as pragmatism. That night, he visited Marianne with a book of Pablo Neruda poems Maria had left behind, not forgotten, but deliberately abandoned as a gift for someone who might need poetry in a language other than English. Reading Neruda's Spanish aloud, Richard discovered that some emotions translated across linguistic barriers, while others became more beautiful in their original form. 3 months after Maria's departure, Richard received news that changed everything he'd understood about the choices he'd made and the prices they'd extracted from everyone involved. The call came from Helena during a board meeting Richard was chairing, her voice carrying urgency that made him excuse himself to take the conversation privately. "Mr. Harrison, you need to come to the medical facility immediately. There's been a significant change in Mrs. Harrison's condition." The drive across Manhattan felt simultaneously eternal and instantaneous, traffic lights becoming obstacles to overcome rather than travel rhythm to accept. Richard's mind cycled through possibilities: improvement or deterioration, temporary change or permanent shift, hope or the kind of news that would redefine the future yet again. He found Helena in Marianne's room, attending to monitoring equipment that was registering activity significantly different from the steady, mechanical patterns that had characterized the previous 9 months. Marianne's eyes were open, not the vacant stare of medically induced unconsciousness, but the focused attention of someone trying to process information about unfamiliar surroundings. "She began responding to stimulus about an hour ago," Helena explained, her professional demeanor barely containing excitement. That breakthrough moments in coma recovery were rare enough to feel miraculous when they occurred. Eye tracking, response to voice, some movement in her right hand. "Doctor, Peterson is on his way, but the initial signs are very positive." Richard approached Marianne's bed with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to invest too heavily in hope until hope had been medically verified. But when Marianne's eyes focused on his face with unmistakable recognition, when her lips moved to form his name in a whisper so soft he had to lean close to hear it, he understood that the woman he'd been reading poetry to for months had indeed been listening. Richard. Her voice was barely audible, rusty from disuse but clear in its intention. "The children, are they—" "They're fine," he assured her, taking her hand and feeling her fingers respond with pressure that was weak but definite. "They're at school. I'll call them. They'll want to see you." "Listen." Marianne's attention drifted around the room, taking in medical equipment and floral arrangements and evidence of care that had been maintained during her absence from consciousness. "How long?" she asked. 9 months, Richard replied, the time span sounding both impossibly long and remarkably brief when reduced to numbers. "You've been asleep for 9 months." Her expression shifted through confusion, sadness, and something that might have been relief. "I remember the argument," she said. "In the car. I was angry about something that doesn't matter now." "Nothing matters now except that you're awake," Richard said, though even as he spoke the words he understood they weren't entirely accurate. Many things mattered. The choices made during her absence, the relationships developed and lost, the ways crisis had changed everyone who'd lived through it. Over the following hours, as news of Marianne's improvement spread through the network of family and medical professionals who'd been involved in her care, Richard found himself thinking repeatedly about Maria, the woman who'd insisted that love doesn't stop when someone can't love back the same way, who'd encouraged him to read poetry instead of financial reports, who'd treated Marianne's unconscious form with the respect due to someone temporarily absent rather than permanently gone. "The house," Marianne said during one of their conversations as she slowly reacquainted herself with the details of her life. "It feels different, warmer. Did you redecorate?" Richard considered how to explain the changes that had occurred in their home during her absence, not in furnishings or paint colors, but in atmosphere, in the way spaces had been inhabited rather than simply occupied. "We had help," he said finally. "Someone who understood how to make a house feel like a place where people could heal." "I'd like to thank her," Marianne replied, her voice still weak but carrying genuine gratitude. "Someone who takes care of your family while you're unable to take care of your heart too." The observation struck Richard with its accuracy and its implications. Maria had indeed taken care of their hearts. Susan's anger, Michael's withdrawal, his own grief-paralyzed inability to function as anything other than a financial provider. She'd done emotional labor that no employment contract could adequately describe or compensate, work that had required not just skill but profound empathy and patience, and he'd allowed other people's discomfort with that kind of care to drive her away before Marianne could wake up to thank her personally. That evening, after Marianne had been moved to a regular hospital room and Susan and Michael had arrived to begin their own joyful but complicated process of reconnecting with their newly conscious mother, Richard made a decision that felt simultaneously overdue and terrifying. He called Charlotte. "I need Maria Rodriguez's current contact information," he said without preamble when his sister answered. "Richard, Marianne is awake. This is hardly the time to—" "This is exactly the time," he interrupted, his voice carrying authority that Charlotte recognized as non-negotiable. "Marianne wants to thank the woman who took care of our family while she couldn't. And I want to apologize to the person I should have defended instead of sacrificing to other people's prejudices." Charlotte's silence stretched long enough for Richard to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice carried resignation rather than argument. "She's working for the Hendersons on the Upper East Side. I can get you the number." "Do that," Richard replied. "And Charlotte? The next time you're tempted to interfere in my family's relationships, remember that some of the most important people in our lives are the ones you think don't belong there." The conversation with Maria, when it finally occurred 2 days later, was more difficult than Richard had anticipated. Her voice over the phone carried polite warmth but also distance that hadn't existed during their final face-to-face conversation. She congratulated him on Marianne's recovery with genuine happiness, but declined his invitation to visit the hospital or return to work for the Harrison family. "I have a good job now," she explained matter-of-factly. The Hendersons are kind people who treat me with respect. I can't risk that security for a situation that might change again when other people decide it's inappropriate. Richard understood her position even as it frustrated him. He'd forfeited his right to ask for trust when he'd chosen family politics over personal loyalty, and trust, once broken, couldn't be restored through apologies alone. "Marianne wants to thank you personally," he tried, "and the children would like to see you." "Then perhaps," Maria suggested gently, "we could meet somewhere neutral. A coffee shop or a restaurant where it's clear this is friendship rather than employment, where people like your sister can't misinterpret what they see." They arranged to meet at a small cafe in the village, a place where expensive suits and work uniforms coexisted without anyone questioning the appropriateness of their proximity. Richard arrived early and chose a table by the window where natural light would soften the awkwardness he anticipated in trying to express gratitude for gifts that couldn't be adequately repaid. Maria appeared exactly on time, dressed in street clothes rather than the simple work outfits he'd grown accustomed to seeing, her appearance reminding him that she had a life and identity completely separate from her role in his household. She looked well, not just healthy, but settled in ways that suggested her current situation provided the kind of stability that his employment hadn't been able to guarantee. They talked for nearly 2 hours, conversation flowing with the ease that had characterized their kitchen discussions during her final weeks in the penthouse. Maria shared details about her new job, employers who appreciated her skills without feeling threatened by her competence, children who'd learned her name and used it regularly, work that felt valued rather than merely tolerated. In return, Richard described Marianne's recovery process, the ways family dynamics were slowly readjusting to include someone who'd been absent during months of significant change. Susan's protective anger slowly giving way to cautious hope. Michael's gradual willingness to believe that good things might occasionally happen rather than constantly preparing for the next crisis. "They ask about you," Richard admitted. "Susan especially. She says you taught her that anger and love can exist together, that she doesn't have to choose just one emotion about complicated situations." Maria's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who'd planted seeds in ground that had proven fertile. She's going to be a strong woman, the kind of strength that comes from surviving difficult things without losing kindness. As their conversation wound toward conclusion, Richard finally addressed the topic that had prompted their meeting. "I owe you an apology that's bigger than words can carry," he said. "I should have defended you instead of sacrificing you to other people's prejudices. I should have remembered that loyalty matters more than social appropriateness." Maria considered his words with the same thoughtful attention she'd always brought to difficult conversations. "You were protecting your wife's medical care," she said finally. "Sometimes we have to choose between people we care about, and those choices feel like betrayal no matter which direction we go." "But I didn't choose between you and Marianne," Richard replied. "I chose between you and Charlotte's approval. I chose between you and avoiding conflict with people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered more than your dignity." "Yes," Maria agreed simply. "You did." The acknowledgement carried no anger but also no absolution. Some mistakes could be forgiven without being forgotten. Some relationships could be repaired without being restored to their original form. What remained between them was affection tempered by experience, connection modified by the recognition that good intentions weren't always sufficient protection against circumstances that revealed character through choices made under pressure. They parted with warmth, but also with understanding that this meeting was closure rather than reopening. Maria had moved forward into a life that offered security and respect without the complications that had made their previous relationship ultimately unsustainable. Richard returned to his family's ongoing recovery with gratitude for what Maria had given them, and acceptance that some gifts couldn't be repaid, only honored through the changes they'd inspired. Over the months that followed, as Marianne slowly regained strength and the Harrison family learned to function as a unit that included someone who'd returned from a place none of them could fully understand, Richard found himself applying lessons Maria had taught through example rather than instruction. He treated the new household staff with the kind of respect that acknowledged their full humanity rather than just their professional functions. He learned to recognize the difference between kindness and charity, between appreciation and condescension. Most significantly, he began to understand that the value of work didn't correlate directly with its financial compensation, that some of the most important labor in any society was performed by people whose contributions were often invisible to those who benefited from them most directly. Years later, when Susan graduated from college with plans to work in social services, and Michael announced his intention to study medicine with a focus on rehabilitation therapy, Richard recognized that their current choices reflected values they'd absorbed not just from their parents, but from a woman who demonstrated that caring for others was work that required intelligence, skill, and emotional strength. Marianne, whose recovery had been remarkable but not complete, she walked with a slight limp, spoke more slowly than before, required medication to manage seizures that occasionally interrupted her days, often mentioned Maria in conversations about resilience and healing. She'd retained no memories from her months of unconsciousness, but she'd awakened to stories about someone who'd helped her family survive their crisis with dignity and tact. "I wish I could remember her," Marianne said one evening as they read together in the living room where Maria had once moved with quiet efficiency. "She sounds like someone who understood that loving people means taking care of more than just their obvious needs." Richard looked up from his book. Poetry rather than financial reports, words chosen for beauty rather than information. She understood that some kinds of strength only become visible when people are ready to see them. He said, "And that kindness isn't something you can buy or sell, only recognize when you're lucky enough to receive it." Shortly after their conversation, Richard realized that he'd learned to speak about Maria in present tense again, not because she remained part of their daily lives, but because the lessons she'd taught continued to influence decisions and relationships and the way they understood their obligations to people whose work made their comfort possible. And if you've ever worked quietly in someone else's home, knowing more about their private struggles than they realized, understanding that your presence might be the difference between their family falling apart or finding ways to heal, if you've ever been the person who kept showing up with dignity intact even when recognition was limited and respect had to be earned repeatedly, then you know that some kinds of strength are measured not in the appreciation they receive, but in the changes they inspire in people who might never fully understand what you've contributed to their survival. The truest gratitude isn't always expressed in words or compensation. Sometimes it's carried forward in the way people treat others, the way families learn to function with more kindness than they knew they were capable of, the way children grow up understanding that service is honorable and that the people who care for them when they're vulnerable deserve respect rather than invisibility. Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you been the quiet strength that held someone else's family together during their darkest time? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this story reminded you of your own worth, of the value of work that heals hearts as well as homes, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs to remember that her contributions matter more than her title suggests. For more stories that honor the invisible strength of working women, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us. We'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people discover that their extraordinary hearts have the power to change the world, one quiet act of caring at a time.